In Afghanistan, the weaver of the rug intentionally puts a flaw in every rug to remind him or herself that they are not perfect and that only the Creator has the ability to recreate in a perfect way. So I intentionally put a mistake in the PowerPoint to remind myself that I am not perfect, and probably only the Creator could make the PowerPoint perfect. Let's join in prayer. Gracious and loving God, may the meditations of our hearts, the words of my lips, if they be your words, be worthy and acceptable unto you, and may your word come to your people now, either through me or despite me. Amen. As we embark on this journey of looking at Jesus, of looking at the church, of looking at the Christian life, and both learning about that and hearing the call of Jesus to move into deeper, closer relationship, not only with him, but with each other. Someone asked me a question, and I've really been appreciating all the questions and the feedback. In fact, I love questions and feedback. And one of the questions was, they said to me, like, Jim, like, isn't Jesus just Jesus? And I said, well, like, what do you mean by that? Well, like, he's just Jesus. You know, like, and then they, you know, like, Son of God, Savior, like, he's just Jesus. And it's a great question because Jesus is so woven through the culture of our world and has likely been the most important figure in the history of the past or the present, and the most talked about. And the challenge is, if we can't understand, first of all, the person of Jesus in the context of first century Palestine, if we can't grasp the forces that shaped his life, the people who were around him, how he understood his relationship to God, how his contemporaries saw him, like if we're not kind of grounded there, so that's like going back before we come forward and say, okay, so who is Jesus for me today in my life? We're in danger of committing what the Bible calls idolatry. And idolatry is when we take our unquestioned, unthought out assumptions and values, our prejudices, our fears, and we shape them into something that is godlike. And we give our worthship. That's where the root of the word worship. You know, we give the worth of ourself to that. And that's what idolatry is. You see, we can't treat Jesus like some 21st century Christmas tree that we can hang all our spiritual baggage on, all our fears and all our prejudices, and make that who Jesus is. Because without a solid understanding of both the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, 2,000 years of scholarship and interpretation, we may, without thinking about it, and this is happening in our world, it happens on the internet, it happens in communities, it happens in North America, we may unintentionally uphold Jesuses that sound like this. So here's my list. We might intentionally protect and uphold the white supremacist Jesus, the colonial Jesus, the Eurocentric Jesus, the Jesus of any particular political party, the capitalist Jesus, the communist Jesus, the slave-owning Jesus, the nuclear bomb-dropping North America First Jesus, the organ music stained glass sentimental Jesus, the anti-science know-nothing simpleton Jesus, the prosperity gospel get-rich-quick Jesus, the Jesus that hates indigenous people and wipes out their culture, the cuddly, omnipotent Santa Claus Jesus, the male chauvinistic Jesus, the homophobic Jesus that hates people that are gay, lesbian, and transgendered, Jesus, the South African pro-apartheid Jesus, the Joe Six-Pack Jesus, the anti-Semitic Jesus, the anti-Muslim crusader Jesus. You kind of see where I'm going here. These idols that we make in the world. So that's one reason we need to do it. Now, the other reason is, and this is a caution, if you really get to know Jesus, you better put your hat on your head and you better put your life jacket on because your life could change. Jesus is a really dangerous guy. He makes incredible demands on people. He invites people to take risky and vulnerable steps. Jesus changes lives. So we'll say a bit more about that at the end of the sermon. So can I have that next slide, Joe? So a couple weeks back, before we had the power failure and we all got off schedule, we talked about this image of the perfect storm, and there's copies of the sermon. We sent the sermon out. The sermon's up on YouTube. You can get a copy of it if you weren't here. And we basically said that there were these two incredible forces in Jesus' world. One was the Roman Empire, and one was what N.T. Wright calls the overheated aspirations of the nation of Israel. And the perfect storm was when Jesus stepped into that particular political, religious world, and he understood himself to be, as he says in the passage, the fulfillment of all of Israel's hopes. He was the one that people had been looking for all of their lives and for hundreds of years. And he saw himself as the fulfillment of Israel's plan by God and for the transformation of the world. Now, having said that, there's another part of Jesus' world we need to understand. This one's a little more complex. It's what we call the culture of Jesus' world. So we want to add culture to the portrait of Jesus' world. So I'm going to refer to a book called The New Testament World, Insights from Cultural Anthropology by Bruce C. Molina. It's 250 pages. I bought 100 copies of the book today. I'm going to give you each one and ask you to read it for next week. You got the joke. Could you imagine, I come in and I see Betty the treasurer, and I say, Betty, I bought $2,000 worth of books just to give out today. Can you just pay this bill? Ooh, that would be a tight one. So this is kind of how culture fits into identifying Jesus. So when we look at the Bible and we look at the four Gospels and we look at the very vague but clear references in non-biblical literature to Jesus, we know certain things about Jesus, and we agree across the world of scholarship that this is a fairly accurate picture of Jesus. He was male. He was Joseph was his father. Mary was his mother. He was a carpenter's son. He was likely a carpenter. He had brothers, and he likely had sisters. He understood himself as a prophet, teacher, as a healer, and the fulfillment of all of Israel's aspirations and hopes. We're pretty certain that in the Greco-Roman world, he was born about 4 CE, so 4 after the Common Era. We know he grew up in Nazareth. We have a record of his life, so we know about his teachings, we know about his journeys, we know about his death, and we have witnesses to his resurrection. But what was he really like? And what we are like has something to do with the culture in which we grow up in. And culture is kind of a force and a set of relationships and a set of beliefs that we kind of share in common, that we're conscious of and we're not conscious of, that is part of us but is outside of us, and it kind of just shapes who we are. Now, Molina has, I'll have the next slide, Jonah, has kind of an interesting way of understanding culture. He uses these three statements. He says, all human beings are the same physically. So we're either male or female. We've all got a heart. We've all got a liver. We all got a pancreas. We have basic things that make us all the same. But all people are different because each of us has a persona or a personality. That's a combination of our biochemical brain and a whole bunch of other things. And so, we're all basically human beings in this room. We share that in common, but no one person is the same as another person. And then he goes on to say, all people are the same, and all people are different, and that has something to do with culture. So, let's take Jesus and me. We'll compare. Yeah, I know, it's pretty arrogant, eh? Both of us are male. We have that in same. Both of us are different because we have different personalities. And we are both the same and different because we come from different cultures. So I've grown up in, a 20th century North American, white, Anglo-Saxon culture in a steel city where my father was middle class and we were a traditional nuclear family, and on and on and on. And Jesus, a male, grew up as a dark-skinned person in Palestine, as a Jewish person in the first century. So there's sameness and there's difference. So I want to try just to paint a few very broad strokes of the difference between our culture. So I'm going to just use kind of North American, Ladner, British Columbia in the 21st century, and Jesus' world. And I'm going to understand that there's a bit of exaggeration here to make the point, because you'll see there are some similarities still between our cultures. So the first thing is, in Jesus' world, there was a particular approach to religion. And in Jesus' world, no one ever asked the question, does God exist? Because they all assumed that God or gods existed. And so when you read the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, you see that the people of Jesus' time who were Jewish, they focus a lot on right practice, moral virtues, right duty, right rituals, right actions. Now, when we come from a 21st century North American post-scientific, post-Enlightenment world, the question we most often ask, and you hear it all the time on people's lips, is, does God exist? And when we struggle with that question of God exist, we get into questions of, like, what's the right way to think about something? We talk about intelligence. We talk about theory. The question of God's existence is huge and complicated. And then we get into different religions and different spiritual practices. That would have been so foreign to the world of Jesus. Because in Jesus' world, for the Jewish person, there was what they called one overarching narrative, like one story that everybody who was Jewish understood their life by. God created the world, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah. We live in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious, pluralistic world where we're more influenced by kind of a Greek and Roman way of thinking. So thinking versus doing. In Jesus' world, the supernatural affected everything. There was no real sense of, well, here's the supernatural world, and here's the natural world. Here's the secular world, here's the sacred world. If you went back in a time machine into Jesus' world and you sat down beside the average Jewish person and you said, you know what? In North America, religion has nothing to do with politics. They would look at you and go, pardon me? Because they didn't divide their world that way. Religion, economics, politics, everything was somewhat unified. We're different that way. We have a different sense of the world. Now, the third thing is that Jesus' world was a pre-industrial agricultural world. 90% of the people farmed and spent their whole lives gathering enough raw resources to pay their taxes, to grow food, and to live. Craftsmen made things. Infant mortality rates were huge. Infant birth rates were huge. Literacy levels were really, really low. We live in a different kind of world. We are an industrial, technological, post-agricultural world. Most people now in North America live in cities. Our infant mortality rates are very low. Our infant birth rates are very low. In Jesus' world, your life expectancy was very small. In our world, it's not unusual now to know someone who lives to be 100. We're having a funeral here at the end of February for someone who is 108. Jesus' world was considered to be, because it was smaller, what they call, I got to make sure I get this term right, a high context culture, which meant that you could assume in Jesus' world that if you started to talk about something, everybody would know what you're talking about. Now, we live in a world where it's not possible to know everything about what somebody else is talking about. We live in the world of information overload. That's why the scriptures are sometimes confusing, because Jesus tells a story about a Good Samaritan. And we interpret that story and go, well, we know what a Good Samaritan is. A Good Samaritan is you're driving down the highway, you get a flat tire, 4 or 5 people drive by, and they don't want to get out of their car, or they've got to be someplace, or they might be a little anxious, but somebody stops by, they help you change your tire, and you've met the Good Samaritan. Now, in Jesus' world, amongst Jewish people, as soon as you said Samaritan to a Jewish person, you might as well have said nigger, faggot. It's that kind of evisceral reaction that we have sometimes in culture to people we don't like, because everybody knew the Samaritan was an unclean, impure person who was your enemy. And that Samaritan on the road that got beat up, they should have finished the job, Jesus' viewers would have said. And it would totally blow them apart when 2 Jewish people who are religious leaders pass by another Jewish person and don't help him, and the person who should really kick this guy in the head again, because they've hated each other for hundreds of years, stops and actually helps him, puts him on his donkey, inconveniences himself, makes himself unclean, and pays his motel bill. Now you see, that's a much more powerful story than, the guy that stops and helped me change my tire. So that's what we mean by the high context world. Now the other thing is that if you were rich in Jesus' world, it was because God blessed you. If you were poor in Jesus' world, it was because God had determined that was what your lot was, and you could be being punished or cursed. We don't believe that in the Western world, most of the time. This is where exaggeration comes in. we generally believe that if you're rich and well-to-do and you have a home and you have clothing and you have food, it's because you worked hard. It's a result of your individual effort. It doesn't have anything to do with how God feels about you. Now, the last one is the most complicated one. And there's many more, but we're just going to do this one last more because it's the one that's kind of challenging. Your place in Jesus' world was already predetermined before you were born. Because your place in a family, in a tribe, in a clan, in a city, was determined by your birth. In other words, by your blood. Also by your sex. And you got born into a family, and dependent on where you were in the family and who you were, that determined the rest of your life. There was no such thing as individuality as we understand it. No such thing as upward mobility. No such thing as, well, you know, if your dad wanted you to be a dentist and you became an opera singer, oh, there might be a little disappointment there, but you know, generally we'd be happy for you. Now, you can understand Jesus' world a little bit if you understand what people who come from other cultures, who have a culture like the Middle East, when they come to Canada, and then their children are born here and they grow up in North American culture, and you begin to sense the clash of values between what the family expects, what the mother and father expects, and then the child who's kind of grown up with one foot in the culture of, well, you listen to mom and dad, and if mom and dad say you're going to be a dentist, you're going to be a dentist, versus the culture of individuality. And within that culture, there was rankings. And you were assigned by virtue of who you were and your clan, your blood, your family. You were assigned either honor or shame. So it's very much an honor and shame society. So that if a child in Jesus' world did not do what their father, not their mother, that's why women don't have names in a lot of biblical literature, and it's why Jesus, when he names a woman, is kind of turning the world upside down, because women were just people that had no identity. You know, so when a son does not do what the father wants him to do, the father loses some of his pre-assigned honor, and that vacancy in the father's life is filled with shame. So in the story of the prodigal son, when the younger son says, hey, Dad, you know, cut me a check. I want half the inheritance. It's not mine. It's supposed to go to my older brother, because that's the way things are. And I'm actually dishonoring you hugely, not only to your face, but in front of everybody else in the village. And I'm not even going to do what you want me to do, and then I'm going to go and waste it all, and I'm going to be eating the food that belongs to pigs, and on and on and on. And through this whole episode, the father's honor is just depleting. And the father's shame is increasing. But yet, here's this father. And this is where Jesus is so interesting. He starts to turn over the norms of his own culture, and that's why they want to kill him. They don't want to kill him because he's a nice guy. They don't want to kill him because he's a good shepherd. They don't want to kill him because, you know, he walks around and recruits disciples. He's turning the social fabric of the culture upside down. So here is this father who has been incredibly shamed in front of his whole community. He's at the side of the village looking every day for his son to return. The son who has lost any honor he had and is totally shamed. And in Jesus' day, if you were that son and you wanted to come back to the village, you actually had to go to every family in the village and apologize because you'd actually dishonored them and taken some of their honor away and given them shame. And what you had to do to restore yourself to the Father was pretty ritualistic. And so it makes it even harder for Jesus' audience to understand why when this shamed son comes back to the shamed father takes some of the elder son's honor because he's out there working hard in the field, and he gives that honor with, the ring, the cloth, the feast, to the shamed son. And he shames his elder son. And everybody would be going, well, Jesus, like, why would you expect the elder son to welcome this now ritually impure son who has shamed not only you, but the whole village? You see, and that was so ingrained into Jesus' culture, and it's not our culture, sort of, right? But you can see there where there's some tension. We still struggle with honor and shame as parents, don't we? Sometimes when a child is acting up in church, the parent, unfortunately, is feeling kind of shame, right? And sometimes if we look at the parent whose child is acting up as if we come from the Victorian age, that's kind of a shaming thing. So that's why, there are still parallels, and we don't even need to explain the nameless, unhonored, unknown woman, that whole issue. Very much a part of Jesus' world, hugely ingrained, still in the Middle East, not totally resolved or worked out in our world. So that's just a bit of an example of how culture has to be understood to really grasp the power of the gospel stories. Now, the great thing about Jesus is he was so much a product of his culture, but he so turned his culture upside down. And when I was growing up and didn't understand any of this and going to Sunday school and youth groups, I couldn't understand why you'd want to crucify a nice guy. Right? Those pictures that we used to see hanging on the wall? Like who would want to crucify that guy? But then when you begin to see story after story after story where Jesus is not only turning that world upside down, but turning our world upside down, then you can see why this guy needs to be on a cross, because he's way too much of a threat, not only to that world, but to the way that we do things. So, just to wrap this up, if you listen to the story from this week and last week, it was the calling of the disciples. It's unlikely that a really nice guy with long blonde hair and fair skin, wearing a robe, is going to come up to you one day at your place of work and say, "Hey, Dave, leave your family. Don't worry about your grandson. Come follow me." And if Dave does that, well, we might be thinking that we need to send him to be checked out by a therapist, because likely he's fallen under the spell of a cult leader. Just in case you see this week anybody wandering around telling you that, I want you to just rethink how you answer that one. But despite that, we still believe that in the life we lead, and in the places we walk, and where we work, and where we go to school, and in the relationships we have with one another, Jesus calls us to follow. I believe. Someone asked me the other day, what do I believe? And I said, I believe this. I believe at the center of the universe is this great streaming river of love that we call grace. I believe that this whole world has the handprint of the Creator God. And I choose as a Christian, not that I couldn't choose other religious paths, or that people don't, but I choose as a Christian to believe that we see that love most clearly in the person of Jesus Christ. And when I see that love, I go, I want my life to be a part of that. I want my life to aid the healing of the world, strengthen broken relationships. That's what I love about this church. That's what I want this church to continue to do. And to do that requires us to accept it, to make a commitment. I mean, God's going to love us whether we make a commitment or not. And then we practice together, you know, that spiritual practice thing, what it means to be people of faith in a very broken and hurting world, where sometimes it's hard to believe that love is the central stream. And I think at some point in our lives, as people who are Christian, who profess to be Christian, who are part of a faith community, I believe it's appropriate that we make that commitment. And the way that we make that commitment in a Protestant tradition is either through an affirmation of faith or a proclamation of faith, through the act of baptism. And in this time together, I've said we're going to have 2 opportunities for people who would like to formally become a member of Christ Church. It's not an organization, it's Christ Church. Either through baptism if they weren't baptized, or through confirmation. And so as we're learning, hopefully we're growing. You turn to the back of the communion bulletin, because we're going to celebrate communion in just a moment. I've got a spiritual practice to invite you to do this week on your own. No one's going to read this. And the spiritual practice is write a letter to God. And so because no one's going to read it, I'm not going to ask you to hand it in. You get a chance to be open and vulnerable. You know, God, what would I like my life to be like? Where am I hurting? Where am I experiencing joy? What am I moving towards? What's my purpose? And I'm going to just ask you to write it and hang on to it. Now, if you really want to take a risk and you really want to be vulnerable, look around, find someone you know, and say, hey, could we get together for coffee this week? Or could we come and sit in the church one morning or one evening and just share the letter? It'd be a hard thing to do. But it might be worth the risk, because it's only vulnerability to God and to one another that in the end deepens relationships. Without vulnerability, things kind of stay at a particular level. Okay. You just got the 250 pages of Melina's book, so you do not have to read it for next week.